So today we are going to look at a topic called carbohydrate metabolism, and these are our objectives. We are going to look at the role of carbohydrates, also describe the processes of glycogenolysis. You see, in our body we have glycogen, that is the stored form of what? Glucose. So many glucose molecules will come together and will be stored as glycogen. So glycogenolysis is when you're breaking down the glycogen back to the what? Glucose molecules. We will also talk about glycolysis, the breakdown of the glucose, and gluconeogenesis. This is where we form glucose using non-carbohydrate substances like amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol. Hope you understand. And we have glycogenesis. Glycogenesis is the opposite of glycogenolysis. Glycogenesis is when you take the glucose molecules and you bring them together to form what? Glycogen. Hope you understand. We will also look at how to calculate the number of ATP molecules we will produce after breaking down what? Glucose. So these are the things that we are going to look in this video. So now let's look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is the major source of energy for all living cells. So for all living things in this world, in their cells, carbohydrate is the major source of energy. And this carbohydrate that I'm talking about is being made by plants. So most of the foods that we eat contains what? Carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are being made by what? Plants. And these plants uses carbon dioxide, water, and what? Sunlight to form what? The carbohydrates. So in other words, I can say that the sunlight is the ultimate source of what? Energy for living organism, because that is what is being used to form what? The carbohydrates, which is the major source of energy for living cells. There is difference between major source and ultimate source. Hope you understand. This carbohydrate, since is the source of energy, it is very important when it comes to sports, because sports, running, playing football, you need energy to do all these things. And the energy, we are getting it from what? Carbohydrate. Hope you understand. So there is a chip in here. What happens when someone's carbohydrate is below normal? A condition we call hypoglycemia. Because your brain also depends on glucose, mainly on glucose for its energy, or mainly on carbohydrate for its energy. When there is low levels of carbohydrates in the body, it affects the brain, and that leads to a certain symptom we call fatigue. So you become weak. You can't perform what? Exercises. Hope you understand. So carbohydrate is very important. And this carbohydrate that I'm talking about, we have three main types. Let's look at it. Let's look at them here. The types. You see, we have monosaccharides. And the monosaccharides examples, we have glucose, we have fructose, and we have what? Galactose. And we also have disaccharide. You can see that two monosaccharides will come together to form the disaccharide. An example of the disaccharides, we have them here. And many of the monosaccharides will come together to form what? Polysaccharide, as you can see in the picture. So when I'm talking about carbohydrates, the main focus here is the monosaccharide. And the monosaccharide, our main focus is the glucose. Why glucose? Glucose because this glucose is the central molecule when it comes to carbohydrate metabolism. If I say glucose is the central molecule when it comes to carbohydrate metabolism, I mean that when you are breaking down glucose, the intermediates that you get can be used in other carbohydrate pathways. So most of the carbohydrate metabolic pathways are connected to what? Glucose. Hope you understand. And that makes glucose the central molecule in carbohydrate metabolism. This glucose that I'm talking about, we can break it down and we can also form it. And forming glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors like fatty acids, amino acids, and glycerol, we call it gluconeogenesis. Hope you understand. Sometimes too, you can form glucose by breaking down glycogen. So glucose can be broken down and can also be formed. So put that in mind. The breaking down of glucose, we call it glycolysis. Some people also call it the Embden-Meyerhof pathway. Embden and Meyerhof are the two scientists that came up with the glycolysis pathway. They made us understand that there is this pathway in our living cells called what? Glycolysis. Hope you understand. So we won't only talk about glycolysis when it comes to carbohydrate metabolism. We will also talk about other pathways like citric acid cycle, gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis, glycogenolysis, hexomonophosphate pathway, which we also call the pentose phosphate pathway. We also talk about galactose metabolism and fructose metabolism. We will look at all these pathways one after the other. But today our focus is on the first one, which is glycolysis. Glycolysis. Hope you understand. So now, let's look at how glucose enter our cells. How glucose enter our cells. You see, the plasma, which is the blood, and the cell, they all have glucose molecules. But the glucose molecules are more in the plasma as compared to the cells. And you know that substances like to move from where they are highly concentrated to where they are lowly concentrated. So most of the glucose molecules wants to move from the plasma to our cells. So they want to move from the blood into our cells. But glucose is very large. Glucose is what? Very large. And it can't enter the cells through what? Simple diffusion. So it needs channels in order to what? Enter into our cells through a process we call facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion. You guys have learned this in physiology. So now, most of the transporters that will transport glucose from the plasma into our cells, these transport systems are being divided into two main types. We have those that are insulin dependent, and those that are what? Insulin independent. So the transport systems that will transport the glucose into our cells, some are insulin dependent and some are insulin independent. And the glucose transporters that are insulin dependent are mostly being found in our muscles and in our adipose tissue. Please take note of this. Most of the transport systems that are insulin dependent are mostly found in our muscles and in our adipose tissue. And those that are insulin independent are being found in our liver cells, in our red blood cells, and also in our brain. The liver cells, the red blood cells, and the brain. The glucose transporters there doesn't depend on what? Insulin. Please keep that in mind. We have 14 types of glucose transporters. We have glucose transporter 1 to glucose transporter 14. And these glucose transporters are tissue specific. They are tissue specific. When I say they are tissue specific, for example, glucose transporter 1 is mostly being found in erythrocytes, which is our red blood cells, and in fetal tissues. So it is specific for what? Erythrocytes and fetal tissue. And we have glucose transporter 4, which is specific in skeletal muscles and adipose tissue. And I told you earlier that the glucose transporters that are insulin dependent are mostly being found in the muscles and adipose tissue. And right now I'm telling you that glucose transporter 4 is the one that is being found in skeletal muscles and adipose tissue. In other words, I can say that glucose transporter 4 is insulin dependent. Hope you understand. Yes, so these glucose transporters, they are what? Tissue specific. When I say a certain channel depend on insulin, what does it mean? It means that when there is high levels of insulin, this insulin will increase the number of that transporter. So high level of insulin will increase the number of glucose transporter 4 in the skeletal muscle and adipose tissue, and low levels of insulin will decrease the number of what? The glucose transporter 4. And this is what happens in type 2 diabetes, because in type 2 diabetes, the cells, the receptors that receive the insulin becomes resistant to the insulin. They don't respond to what? Insulin. They don't follow the instructions of insulin. So when insulin binds to what? The receptor, there is no command. There is no increase in glucose transporter 4. Thereby, the glucose molecules will accumulate in the plasma or in the blood, leading to a condition we call type 2 diabetes mellitus. Hope you understand. Now let's look at glycolysis. Glycolysis is derived from the Greek word. Glycolysis is a Greek word, and when we break it down, we have glyco, which is sugar or glucose, and the lysis means breakdown. So in other words, we are breaking down what? Glucose. And this is a universal pathway in living cells. Every cell in our body has this glycolysis pathway going on in it. And this glycolysis that I'm talking about actually occur in the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is also called the cytosol. The cytosol. Hope you understand. So let me give you a brief introduction to glycolysis by using this picture. You see, glucose is a 6 carbon molecule. Glucose is a 6 carbon molecule. And in glycolysis, it is being broken down into 2 3 carbon molecules called pyruvic acid, as you can see. So the 6 carbon molecule called glucose will be broken down into what? 2 molecules, 2 3 carbon molecules called what? Pyruvic acid. And in the process, we will invest 2 ATP. As you can see, we are investing what? 2 ATP. And at the end of the glycolysis pathway, we are going to make 4 ATPs. We are going to make 4 what? ATPs. But because we invested 2 ATPs, our net ATP will be 2, not 4. So it will be 4 minus the 2 that we invested. So our net ATP will be 2. And also in the pathway, we will what? We will gain 2 molecules of what? NADH. 2 molecules of what? NADH, as you can see. So that is an introduction to what? Glycolysis, or an overview. So, what is the fate of this pyruvic acid that we form? This pyruvic acid will be converted to a molecule we call acetyl-CoA. And after being converted to acetyl-CoA, it will enter into the mitochondria. It will enter into the mitochondria and undergo another metabolic pathway we call the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle, or the TCA cycle. The TCA cycle. Hope you understand. Hope you understand that part. Now, let's look at some features of this glycolysis pathway that I'm talking about. This glycolysis that I'm talking about, as I said, it is being taking place in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis can occur in two conditions. It can occur when there is the presence of oxygen, that means aerobic condition. And it can also occur when there is absence of oxygen, that is anaerobic condition. So let's look at something here. So you can see that in the presence of oxygen, the glucose is being converted to pyruvate. And this pyruvate in the presence of oxygen will be converted to acetyl-CoA and enter into the Krebs cycle, where more energy are being produced. And further, the molecules will enter into electron transport chain, where more energy are being produced. Hope you understand. But in the absence of oxygen, which is the anaerobic condition, the pyruvate that is being formed will be fermented into lactic acid and alcohol. Hope you understand. So glycolysis can occur in both aerobic condition and anaerobic condition. Hope you understand. Yes. So now those are the important things that you have to know. So now let's move straight to the steps in glycolysis. We have 10 steps in glycolysis, and these 10 steps are being divided into two phases. We have the preparatory phase and we have the payoff phase. In the preparatory phase, the glucose is being prepared. Let me do something here for you to see. In the preparatory phase, the glucose is being prepared, and in the preparation, this glucose is being converted into two molecules into 2,3 carbon molecules called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. In the preparatory phase, the glucose is being converted into 2,3 carbon molecules called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And in the preparatory phase, we will invest 2 ATPs. ATPs. Hope you understand. And this happens in step 1 to step 5. This happened in step 1 to step 5. So step 1 to step 5 is known as the preparatory phase. Hope you understand.